The cleaner thought she was alone, but the billionaire saw everything and changed it all. At 11:47 p.m., when the last executive had left the building and every office light on the 32nd floor had gone dark, Maria Alvarez quietly knelt beside a trash bin and began picking up the broken pieces of a glass trophy with her bare hands. Nobody was supposed to see her. She had learned to move through the enormous glass tower like a shadow, cleaning behind people who never looked at her, wiping fingerprints from conference tables where million-dollar decisions were made, and collecting the coffee cups left behind by men who earned more in a day than she could make in a year. But that night, someone was watching. From the dark corner of the hallway, Billionaire CEO Daniel Carter stood completely still, staring at the woman on the floor. He had seen employees laugh at her, ignore her, and sometimes treat her as if she were invisible. But what he witnessed that night would change not only Maria's life, but the entire company he had spent 20 years building. Before we continue, if you believe that kindness can give someone a second chance and that every person deserves dignity regardless of their job or social status, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to Kindness Corner. Your support helps us bring more stories about courage, compassion, and unexpected second chances. Maria had never expected her life to become this difficult. 5 years earlier, she had been a proud mother working 2 jobs while raising her 8-year-old daughter, Sophia. Her husband had died suddenly after a construction accident, leaving behind medical bills, a small apartment, and a little girl who still believed her father might somehow walk through the front door one day. Maria had no wealthy relatives, no savings, and no one waiting to rescue her. So she did what millions of struggling parents do every day. She swallowed her fear, wiped away her tears, and kept moving. During the day, Maria cleaned offices in the Carter Financial Tower. At night, she cleaned a small restaurant across town. She returned home after midnight, often exhausted enough to fall asleep in her work clothes, but she always checked Sophia's homework before going to bed. Her daughter knew that her mother was tired, but she didn't understand just how tired. Maria never complained. She wanted Sophia to remember her mother as strong, not broken. The Carter Tower was unlike any building Maria had ever worked in. The lobby was made of polished marble, enormous windows overlooked the city, and expensive artwork hung on walls that probably cost more than her entire apartment building. Executives walked through the halls wearing tailored suits and expensive watches. Some greeted one another by first name. Others barely noticed the cleaners. Maria didn't expect anyone to notice her. In fact, she preferred it that way. Her job was simple: clean, disappear, repeat. But Maria had a habit that made her different from everyone else. Whenever she found something someone had accidentally dropped, she returned it. Wallets, watches, phones, important documents. Once, she found an envelope containing $10,000 in cash inside a conference room. She immediately turned it in, even though the money could have paid several months of rent. The receptionist had laughed when Maria handed it over. She had asked why Maria didn't keep at least some of it. Maria had simply smiled and said that she couldn't teach her daughter honesty if she didn't practice it herself. What Maria didn't know was that Daniel Carter had heard about that incident. Daniel was 42, the founder and CEO of Carter Financial Group. He had built the company from almost nothing after his own father died when Daniel was 17. He was famous for being brilliant, disciplined, and extremely private. Newspapers often described him as cold because he rarely smiled in public. Employees called him intimidating. Investors called him ruthless. But there was another side of Daniel that almost nobody knew. His mother had once worked as a hotel housekeeper. She had raised Daniel alone after his father's death, working 12-hour shifts and coming home with aching feet. Daniel had never forgotten how invisible she had been to wealthy guests who left dirty rooms behind. He had promised himself that if he ever became successful, he would never allow people to be treated the way his mother had been treated. Unfortunately, somewhere along the way, the promise had become buried beneath meetings, acquisitions, lawsuits, deadlines, and billions of dollars. Then Maria reminded him. It started with a small incident. One rainy afternoon, Maria was cleaning the executive floor when she heard a young employee crying inside an empty conference room. The woman, Emily, had just received an email saying she was being fired. She had made a mistake on an important financial report, and her manager had blamed everything on her. Maria didn't know Emily well, but she sat beside her for nearly 20 minutes while the woman cried. Maria didn't offer money or advice. She simply stayed. Before leaving, Maria quietly placed a chocolate bar from her lunch bag on the table. Emily looked at it with tears in her eyes. Maria told her that sometimes life made people believe one mistake defined them, but it didn't. She reminded Emily that being fired from one job didn't mean she had failed at life. What neither woman realized was that Daniel had been standing outside the room. He had heard everything. That evening, he asked his assistant about Maria. He learned that she was a contract cleaner, that she had a daughter, that she worked 2 jobs, and that she had never received a formal complaint. In fact, her attendance record was almost perfect. Daniel wondered why a woman like Maria was working herself to exhaustion while executives in his building complained about minor inconveniences. Then came the night that changed everything. It was almost midnight. Daniel had stayed late after a difficult board meeting. The company was preparing for a major merger, and the pressure had been enormous. He was walking toward the private elevator when he heard a crash. He followed the sound. Maria was kneeling on the floor, surrounded by broken glass. A trophy had fallen from a shelf after a heavy cleaning cart accidentally bumped into it. Maria had cut her palm, but instead of calling someone, she was quietly picking up the pieces. Daniel watched from the shadows. He saw Maria wrap her bleeding hand in a paper towel. He saw her continue cleaning. Then he saw her notice a small engraved plaque among the broken pieces. The trophy belonged to a former employee who had spent 25 years with the company. Maria carefully wiped the dust from the plaque and placed it safely on a nearby table. Then she sat down for a moment. For the first time, Daniel saw her exhaustion. Maria lowered her head and quietly cried. Not loudly. Not dramatically. She simply covered her face with one hand and let a few tears fall. Then she pulled out her phone. Daniel could not hear everything, but he heard enough. Sophia had called to say she was hungry. Maria looked at the time and realized she hadn't eaten dinner herself. She promised her daughter that she would bring breakfast home in the morning. Then she smiled into the phone. That smile broke something inside Daniel. Because Maria had been crying seconds earlier, but she didn't want her little girl to hear sadness in her voice. Daniel stepped out of the shadows. Maria immediately stood up, embarrassed. She apologized for still being there and tried to explain what had happened. She expected anger. She expected a complaint. Instead, Daniel looked at her injured hand. He asked why she hadn't reported the accident. Maria simply said she didn't want to make trouble. Those words stayed with Daniel. The next morning, he called an emergency meeting with the company's senior leadership team. He asked how many contract workers were employed in the building. Nobody knew. He asked what they were paid. His executives had to check. He asked whether they had health coverage. Again, nobody knew. Daniel sat silently for several seconds. Then he asked the question that made the room uncomfortable. How could they expect to build a company worth billions while knowing almost nothing about the people who kept that company functioning every night? The room went silent. Within weeks, Daniel ordered a complete review of the company's contract worker policies. Cleaners received better wages, medical assistance, paid leave, and proper safety equipment. Employees were encouraged to report mistreatment without fear of losing their jobs. But Daniel didn't stop there. He wanted to help Maria personally. He offered her a permanent position in the company, but Maria initially refused. She believed she wasn't qualified for anything beyond cleaning. Daniel asked her what she would do if money were not a problem. Maria thought for a long moment. She said she would open a small bakery because her daughter loved baking. Daniel smiled. He told Maria that perhaps she should stop thinking about what she was qualified to do and start thinking about what she had survived. He offered to pay for her education and business training. Maria was terrified. She had spent so many years surviving that dreaming felt dangerous. But eventually she accepted. During the following year, Maria worked part-time while studying business management. She struggled with computers, accounting, and complicated paperwork. There were nights when she wanted to quit because everyone around her seemed younger and more educated. But Daniel never allowed her to give up. He didn't hand her success. He gave her opportunities. There was an important difference. Maria eventually launched a small catering company called Sophia's Table. At first, she prepared food from her tiny apartment kitchen. Orders came slowly. Some days she made only enough to cover expenses. Then a major company event needed catering. Daniel recommended Maria's business, but he made one condition. The company would judge her by the same standards as every other vendor. Maria won the contract on her own. Within 2 years, Sophia's Table employed 15 people, including several single parents who had struggled to find stable work. Maria never forgot what it felt like to be invisible. So she built her company around dignity. She made sure every employee had fair wages, paid time off, and a chance to learn new skills. Meanwhile, Daniel's company changed too. The culture of the tower became different. Executives began learning the names of cleaners and security guards. Managers were required to participate in community programs. Contract workers were invited to company events instead of being treated as invisible background figures. One evening, Daniel walked through the lobby and saw an older cleaner struggling to carry several boxes. Before anyone else could react, he picked up half of them. The woman looked shocked. Daniel simply smiled and said that someone had once taught him that a person's job did not determine their worth. Years later, Maria stood on a stage in front of hundreds of people as she received an award for community leadership. Her daughter Sophia, now a confident young woman, stood beside her. Maria looked toward Daniel sitting quietly in the audience. She didn't thank him for making her rich. Because he hadn't. He had given her something more important. He had seen her. He had seen the woman behind the uniform, behind the tired smile, behind the cleaning cart and late-night shifts. After the ceremony, Maria walked over to Daniel. She told him that the night he found her crying in that hallway, she believed her life was falling apart. Daniel smiled and said that he had thought the same thing. But sometimes, he explained, what looks like an ending is simply the moment when someone finally notices you need a door opened. Maria looked at the enormous building behind them. She remembered the woman she had once been, kneeling on a cold marble floor with a bleeding hand, afraid that asking for help would make her weak. Then she looked at her daughter. Sophia was smiling. Maria realized she had not needed someone to save her. She had needed someone to remind her that she was worth saving. And that became the lesson she carried for the rest of her life. Years later, Maria would still tell people that Daniel Carter had changed her life. But Daniel always corrected her. He said she had changed her own life. He had simply been lucky enough to see her when the rest of the world was looking away. That was the truth. Sometimes heroes don't arrive with grand speeches or dramatic rescues. Sometimes they simply notice the person everyone else ignores. Sometimes kindness is not about giving someone everything. Sometimes it is about opening a door, offering respect, and saying, without words, I see you. You matter. And Maria never forgot the night she thought she was completely alone. Because that was the night someone finally saw everything. If this story touched your heart, please don't just watch and scroll away. Like the video, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Kindness Corner for more stories reminding us that one act of compassion can change a life. Your support truly means more than you know. And before we end, I want to ask you something special. Comment, "I see you," if you believe everyone deserves to be treated with kindness and dignity, no matter who they are or what job they do. Because somewhere tonight, there may be a Maria quietly working while the world walks past her. Maybe she is a cleaner. Maybe he is a security guard. Maybe they are a delivery driver, a waiter, a nurse, a single parent, or simply someone fighting a battle nobody knows about. And maybe all they need is for one person to notice. One person to care. One person to remind them that being overlooked does not mean being worthless. Maria thought she was alone. She wasn't. And because one person stopped long enough to see her, an entire life changed.